So if you could kindly make your way to your seat, we are going to have our first keynote of the morning. So our first keynote this morning is Teillet on legal perspectives on Indigenous citizenship in the Academy, and it'll be hosted by Dr. Beverly Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs was recently appointed as Senior Advisor to the President on Indigenous Relations and Outreach at the University of Windsor, and she practices law part-time at her home community of 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs, who will introduce our esteemed keynote speaker.
Gano sukego, diaso goenkyuse, ganyange haga nyagwai shouta, hodinashoni. Greetings of peace to all of you. I'm Mohawk, Bear Clan from 6 Nations, Grand River Territory, and I told you my real name, which is Goenkyuse, and it means she's visiting. So I'm a visitor in these territories and honored to present and introduce the first keynote speaker. Honored to be on this territory of Treaty 4, and I'm a member of NUSLA, and very happy to be here and seeing old friends and meeting new friends. And this is a very important issue, complex issue, and I just wanted to say that working within these colonial institutions that we're working in, and colonization itself, we have to be reminded that that's where this stems from. And that the issues that we're having to deal with on an institutional basis is what we're having to deal with, these colonial institutions, and trying to work within them. So I've known Jean for a very long time. We have been colleagues for a really long time, and I'm very honored and appreciate her knowledge. So Jean is the senior counsel with Pape Teillet, and she specializes in Indigenous rights law. And she's been engaged in negotiations and litigation with provincial and federal governments concerning Métis and First Nations land rights, harvesting rights, and self-government. So I'd like to proudly introduce our esteemed speaker, keynote. Thank you.
I find myself so enjoying re-meeting people from such a long time ago. I want to say thank you to Jacqueline and everybody who invited me here. It is an honor to be part of this discussion. And I also want to thank everybody who spoke ahead of me. Almost every one of you, I've taken to heart what you said or tried to, and we'll probably continue to over the next few days. I also want to acknowledge the elders in the room and some old friends, Norm, from many years, Maria, and thank them for years and years and years of teachings. So I also want to say, I'm delighted to be on Treaty 4 territory and this part of the Métis Nation motherland. So I'm told that we should introduce ourselves by saying, who are your people? Who's your grandmother? Where are you from? So my grandmother was Sarah Riel, and Sarah's parents, so my great-grandparents, were Joseph Riel. Joseph was Louis Riel's younger brother, and he was married. His first wife was Eleanor Poitras, and she's my great-great-grandmother. He married again Amanda Perron after, but my grandmother is his first, great-grandmother is his first wife. So then it goes up to my great-great-grandparents were Francois Poitras and Madeline Fisher. And Madeline was Cuthbert Grant's sister's daughter. So I'm a Grant and a Fisher and a Poitras and a Riel. And I was quite literally born on the banks of the Red River in Winnipeg. And I mean that literally, on the banks of the Red River. And I was born and raised in St. Boniface and St. Vital. And my family's all still there, although lots of them are also in St. Norbert. So I'm part of those three Métis communities, and I think I'm probably what you would call your classic Red River Métis. So that's who I am. I now live in Vancouver, where the daffodils are up. I just have to rub that in on the prairies. So most of you will know that I was retained by the University of Saskatchewan to do an independent employment investigation into Dr. Carrie Barassa when all of this arose, the questions about her identity. And I agreed to do that as a lawyer, as an independent investigator, right? So in other words, I'm entirely independent from the university in coming to my findings and in the investigation. In the course of that investigation, I interviewed 60 people, many of whom are in this room today. Just as the investigation was wrapping up, Dr. Barassa resigned from her employment position, which effectively ended the investigation, because once she resigns, the university had no more ability to investigate it. Rather than lose all the work that I'd been doing for the better part of a year, they asked me to do a report on Indigenous identity fraud generally and not address the Carrie Barassa issue at all. So I agreed to do that, in part because one of the reasons I agreed to be the investigator was because this issue I think is so important, and I wanted to start putting a pin in it, like just okay. And as far as I knew, this was the first legal investigation that had been conducted. All the other work has been sort of, if I can put it this way, internecine squabbles almost within the university. Someone will lay a complaint and then they'll slap a harassment against them, and it gets to be this back and forth. Then I think Lynn's explained some of that today. So this was a chance to do something that pulled it out of that sort of cross struggle. And I particularly was pleased when I could do the report without focusing on an individual and just talk about the big issues and how we got to this point and where we're going from there. So I want to say that everything I learned out of here, I need to give you a list of credits because I learned so much from the people I interviewed. So I'm going to just rattle off Carolyn Tate, Winona Wheeler, Raven Sinclair, Kathy Pruden Nansell, Sherry Farrell Rossette, Brenda McDougall, Kim Tallbear, Chris Anderson, Daryl LaRue, Veldon Coburn, Pam Palmater, Conrad Prince, and Jeffrey Hewitt. And also some of the elders, Maria Campbell, Norm Fleury, Louise Half, and Eugene Arcand. So just to say that what I'm going to talk to you about is a collection of information that I have collated and tried to put together from multiple sources. And I'm grateful to everyone for their contributions to this. I could never have done it by myself. So caveats. Before I go any further, nothing in what I'm going to say is intended to be about an individual person unless I name them. Okay. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk generically about things. And the only people I'm going to refer to generically are going to be, or not, that I'm going to name are the people who have been very public and published public statements about what they said. So nothing is from my personal investigation work. Now, the second caveat is that while we're talking about pretendians, and I have to say, first off, I really dislike the word. And the reason I don't like it is because it's too cute. I mean, I get it, it's clever. It's a clever word to put pretend and Indians together. It's really clever. But the word pretend, to my mind, is that's what children do. They pretend. It's game playing. It's harmless. And so when we use the word pretendian, to my mind, it conveys the idea that this is harmless. And I think what we've all said in this room is that it is anything but harmless. So I try to shy away from that word. I wish someone would come up with a better word that didn't seem to convey the idea that this is just a game. So part of the reason I say that is because nothing that I want to say here, and I think it's one of the cautions we all need to take, nothing we're doing when we're talking about Indigenous identity fraud is meant to stop people like 60s scoop people from reconnecting, right? And that's one of the problems that a lot of people raise all the time is that, well, sometimes they don't know who their people are. But that's a story, and it's a legitimate story, and it needs to be told. So I think we have to approach this whole topic, and here I'm particularly wary of some of the personal experience that happened to me last fall, that we need to be kind in this discussion. It's bad. The actions are bad. It's inappropriate. What these people are doing is harmful, but it's not murder. It's not rape. It is something that we have to approach with some kind of air of understanding. So I'm going to say that because last fall, I was on my way to the Indigenous Bar Association conference in Ottawa, and I had just handed my report in on September 29th to the University of Saskatchewan, and they had told me that they were going to make it public within like 10 days or 2 weeks. So on October 12th, I was on a plane heading to Montreal for the Indigenous Bar Association conference, and I got off the plane in Montreal, and in the taxi towards the hotel, I was scrolling through the news, and the Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond story dropped. While I was watching the CBC news feed, it dropped, and I started reading it. And the Indigenous Bar Association, knowing I was writing this report for the University of Saskatchewan, asked me to do a presentation, much like I'm doing today, on the issue of Indigenous identity fraud for the Indigenous Bar Association. None of us knowing that the Mary Ellen story was going to drop right as we were starting our conference. So Mary Ellen, of course, is a very well-known lawyer. She is a member of the Indigenous Bar Association. We have given her our highest honor, the Indigenous Peoples Council Award, which I personally also am honored to carry. So as I'm driving up to the hotel, I'm just finishing reading it, and everybody else is getting the same news. Now, what made it really difficult and what made me really focus on the kindness aspect was that Mary Ellen's nephew, Drew Lafond, is the president of the Indigenous Bar Association. And so he was there, but her daughter was there. Her daughter, Portia, who was a second-year law student at UVic. And I saw Portia standing there as I was walking into the hotel. And it just broke my heart just to sit there and think, oh, how on earth are we going to do this? How am I going to talk about this without hurting this beautiful young girl? So it's very hard, this stuff, and it touches innocent people in very, very hurtful ways. So I think, Jacqueline, you said this morning that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to sort of take strides forward. And I really think that's something we have to take to heart here, that we are going to have to be careful in our way of approaching this and moving forward. So I still feel for Portia. I don't know what it's like for her to be in that law school and have all this media attention on her mother. I think it's very, very sad, and my heart goes out to her. So I'm going to say to all of us here, I'm going to repeat my wish that we be kind in our thoughts and in the way we deal with this, even in our anger and even in our sense that we've been hurt. We still have to do our best to approach this with some kindness. So having said that, I'm intrigued that people ask me to come and talk about legal perspectives, because the law is something that usually makes people's eyes glaze over, right? I mean, it's just something people don't really want to talk about very much. But this issue is touching a lot of legal perspectives. And I just want to start off by saying, I don't have all the answers here. I don't think anybody has all the answers here. We are working our way through a problem here, and there's no one answer that's going to be right in every situation, and it's a multiply complicated, multi-layered problem. So we might have an answer for one aspect of it, but not these ones. So I think we have to remember that. So I'm going to try and tease apart some of the legal issues so that we can get because I think the more we start to understand that maybe this strand isn't connected to this one, or how they're related, that might help us a little bit. So I'm going to talk about language. I'm going to talk about principles about citizenship. I'm going to talk about the distinction between identity and citizenship. I'm going to talk about ancestry versus heritage. I'm going to talk about the legal mess created by Canadian laws and the courts, notably the Supreme Court of Canada, and Indigenous identity, fraud, and remedies, and then just a few conclusion remarks. So language, first of all, I've already told you I don't like the word pretendian, but I think this idea of citizenship and membership is an interesting language discussion. So I see this is the Indigenous Citizenship Forum now, and there was a lot of discussion last year. And by the way, I thought last year's forum was amazing. I learned a lot at it about the word identity and the word citizenship. And so, and I think Kim Tallbear said she's kind of leaning to don't quite like the word identity. And there's a lot of talk about it being a sort of a Western social science, personal perspective and everything. And I sort of tended to, because personally, whenever Kim says something, I go, yeah, that's so smart, because she is so smart. But then I went away and thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I think there's more to be said on this discussion about the word identity. First of all, I don't think we can get around it. We can just put it in the garbage can and think it's going to go away into the landfill. It's not. It's here with us. So we have to deal with it. But mainly what I thought of, and I thought the first witness this morning approached it really well. The idea of identity, I think we should be approaching it from an Indigenous perspective, not from a Western social sciences perspective. It's the Western social sciences analysis of the word identity that says it's individual, that it is a personal analysis, and that it is about individuals. I don't think Indigenous people think of identity in that way at all. I think we think of it as a relationship. I think we think that, and that's why you say, who are your people? Who's your grandmother? Where are you from? Because you're establishing your geographic relationship and your family relationship, and that's your identity. So I'm not sure that we should jump to throwing that word away entirely I think it would be better for us to speak of it and understand it as in an indigenous way, which is quite different from that Western social science perspective. So I'm thinking that if we do that, because we need the word identity and we need the word citizenship and we need the word membership. So let's talk about citizenship and membership. Okay, so I know we're using the word citizenship for the title of this forum, and I personally like the word citizenship, but the UN Declaration uses membership. So we're already in a legal conundrum. And if any of you in the room are lawyers, you know that if that issue came before a court, they would define them differently. They would assume that you're using two different words, so you mean two different things. They wouldn't think of them as the same. So I'm saying to us, we need to think about this because our issues do end up in the courts and they make a mess of it. A lot of times that witness the Daniels case, which I'll get into later. But the issue then is, what do we mean? Do we mean membership? Do we mean citizenship? So, and then the next question is, don't want to get ahead of myself. Right. Is that, I guess the other last point I want to make about identity is that in all of these topics, that what we're talking about, as I understand it, is that Indigenous identity, Indigenous citizenship, and Indigenous membership are all about dealing with the now, or the people now, or 3 generations back. We're not talking about ancient history. So I think when Maria said so clearly last year, who are your people? Who's your grandmother? Where are you from? When she said, who are your people? I don't understand her to be asking who your people were in 1600s. I understand her to be saying, who are your people now? Who are your people? Who was your grandmother is a story. Who are your parents? Who are your grandmother? Who are your aunties and uncles? Who are the people in your community? Not 500 years ago. So, I think that when we're talking about using the word identity, I don't want to say that we substitute identity for membership or citizenship. I just think that when we're using the word identity, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So we need more from that. So the discussion's complicated already. So I'm going to complicate it a little bit further, but I want to talk about first principles first. So I start from a basic principle in all of this. And the very first principle is that we are nations, not races. We're not a race. So that's an important distinction. If we are a race, then it's all about blood quantity. It's all about that. And it's not about your community. It's not about your culture. It's not about your family. It's not about anything except blood. So I don't like the word race shifters either, because that implies that we're races. Now, we have to be races. If we claim title to land, if we claim rights, races don't have title to land. Races don't have Indigenous rights. It's nations that have title to land. It's nations that have rights. Now, a lot of people, when I was interviewing those 60 people, said to me, oh, they didn't like the political entities. They're just politicians. They're not in the community. Well, if we're nations, that's a political entity, right? So we have to deal with the politics. We have to deal with the fact that politics is part of community. It's part of our cultures. We fight about them, but that's part of politics. So I think that we have to accept that we're nations. Now, this is the basic bedrock principle in the UN Declaration, is that Indigenous peoples are political entities with title and rights. So the very first, it's in section 33, but it's basically says that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. So that's the basic right. We are nations across this country. There are various First Nations, the Métis Nation, Inuit nations. We're nations, and the principle is that you have the right to determine who your members are according to your customs and traditions. So the Métis Nation customs and traditions, which is my nation, are very different from other nations. Some First Nations allow you to adopt in adults. Métis Nation won't have any truck with that. Norm Fleury said, you can't take a pill one day. I don't know if Norm remembers saying this, but you can't take a pill one day and wake up Métis the next, right? And so he's right, right? So what are we saying here? So Indigenous peoples have the right to determine who their members are. That, if we take that first principle that we're nations, the second one that we have the right to determine who our own people are, that means that somebody cannot stand up and say they're a member of us unless we agree, according to our rules and our customs and our traditions, right? So, which vary. So those are the big principles. Now, where does an individual right fit into this? The UN Declaration also says in Section 9 that you have a right to belong, right? That an individual, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to an Indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. Okay, so that's a right to belong, but it's that according to the customs and traditions of the nation concerned. So remember that the right to determine your members is according to your customs and traditions, and the right to belong is according to the nation's customs and traditions. There is nothing in the UN Declaration that allows an individual person to stand up and say, I'm Mi'kmaq, or I'm Cree, or I'm a member of the Kiriganzibi, unless Kiriganzibi agrees that you're a member, or the Mi'kmaq agree that you're a member, or whatever nation it is according to their customs and their traditions. Okay, so in legally, since this is supposed to be a panel on legal perspectives, that is the Canada in, just want to make sure I get the date right, 2021 adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So that's federal law, which says that the government of Canada must, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, take all measures necessary. I like that statement. It's not just pass laws. Take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are consistent with the UN Declaration. Okay, so our laws in Canada are supposed to be becoming consistent with that big principle that we are nations, that we have the right of self-determination, that we can determine who our members are. Okay, now we can look at that and we can say, okay, that's the laws of Canada. That is not what's happening right now. Our laws in Canada are not consistent with that. The Indian Act can in no way be said to be consistent with that, because that is a determination by somebody that they call a registrar in Ottawa as to who is Indigenous or an Indian, because they don't have anything to do with Inuit or Métis, who is First Nations according to their rules and their laws and their ideas, whether you like it or not. So if they decide that they're going to put, so if your First Nation doesn't have control of your own membership list, Ottawa can add members to your list according to whatever they want to do, and you have no say in it. If you have control of your membership list, they can still make that person an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act, but they can't put them on your banned list, right? So this is entirely inconsistent with the principles we just talked about. The Daniels decision, which talks about the fact that anybody who has any amount of Indigenous ancestry can claim to be Métis, and the communities cut out of that, that is entirely inconsistent with the UN Declaration. So the Daniels decision came down 1 month before Canada signed on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So if we want to give the Supreme Court of Canada a little trap door that they can out themselves on and say, well, we didn't know, which I think is not right. That's about the only thing. Other than that, I would say that the Daniels decision is no longer good law. I would say it's been outdated, and especially since 2021, when Canada said they were going to make their laws consistent with the UN Declaration. So this is some of the background legalities that we need to understand when you're implementing your policies and your rules in the academy, that this has to be the ground ruling that we're working from. And remember, the complexity of this is that each First Nation and nation has different rules, right? So as we said, some allow, so we've watched with the Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, Muskeg Lake First Nation says she's one of them because she married in, right? So if that's their rules and that's their way of dealing with things, then that's what they do. And I think we have to accept that. Question I ask you is this, does that make her Indigenous? Or does that just make her a member of Muskeg Lake First Nation? And are those two things different? And like I said, I'm trying to pull strands apart here. I weave, so I think in terms of thread. So pull out that thread. So if that makes us question, then what does it mean to be Indigenous? Is it a different thing from being a member? Because we know that white women were given Indian Act status and therefore are members of bands. Does that make them Indigenous? I'm not questioning their children who will be married in and legitimately Indigenous because their fathers would be Indigenous. But what about her? Is she just a white woman who married in and she remains a white woman member? Or does she become Indigenous by virtue of marriage in? I'm throwing that out to you as a question. What do you think is the way to deal with this? Because some of these people are going to come to your universities and they can say, I'm a member of this First Nation. Is it your obligation then to ask a deeper question, say, yeah, but are you Indigenous? So, or if we say, and I'm going to play the other side of this coin now, if you are a nation and you get to determine your own members, maybe that should be the be all and the end all of the question. That should be just the final answer to the question, is that the nation, we respect the nation's right to determine its members. And so therefore, if they say she's a member, she's a member. You don't dig any further because we have the right to determine these things. So I'm just saying to you, these are the difficulties we're all grappling with right now, and that I don't think we've parsed them apart clearly enough. And certainly just calling it all citizenship doesn't answer those questions. So some of the legal questions out of that are, if First Nations can create citizens, and I think if we accept our first principle, then they can they also take it away? So, for example, with Mary Ellen marries into Muskeg Lake First Nation, what if she and George Lafond get divorced? Can the nation decide to terminate her membership, or is she a member for life? I think those are part of the things that sit with the legal question of the customs and traditions of that First Nation, which may be different from place to place. And I know a lot of First Nations are grappling with this. I was working with one First Nation in the Yukon, and they had several women who had moved on to the First Nation, married, and one of their members had brought children with them from a previous marriage, then got divorced from the guy, the second father, but were using housing, which was in very limited supply. And the First Nations in a quandary about whether they can kick her off. or not, or take the housing back. These are the kinds of issues that First Nations are grappling with. They're terrible conundrums. I don't think anybody wants to leave, kick a young mother with children out of housing, but those are the problems that they're dealing with. Now, we're dealing in the academy with different issues around this, but these are still the issues. Do you have membership or citizenship for life? Again, I don't have the answers for that, but if you're looking for questions you have to ask in terms of verification, those are the kinds of questions you need to be looking at, right? So not only how did you get your membership, but do you still have it? No, most Métis Nation memberships, so my Manitoba Métis Federation card is only good for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or something, and then you have to renew it, right? So, but I don't understand that most First Nations have a renewal clause in their membership. So maybe some do, but those are issues to think about for everybody. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yep. Lots of reasons. I think that if you can't hear, that's just raising some of the more complex issues surrounding the Indiana status card and renewal of cards and all of that. All of which is just me doing, thank you for that, by the way, just raising the fact that there are multiple layers of questions here that we need to be thinking about. So a simple statement about how do you identify is obviously not enough. Now, I was talking to Leroy Littlebear just last week, and he's the new, try and get his title right. Sorry, Leroy, if I blow it. Vice Provost Indigenous Affairs or something like that, Jackie, at Lethbridge University. And he said that what they're developing is, I think it's a 7-stage questions about Indigenous identity, because they're worried that people can identify as Indigenous, but you hire them as a professor. And Leroy's question is, where did they get their knowledge from? Did they get all their knowledge from books that they read at the university? Or do they come from the community and have real community-based knowledge? So maybe in some topics that doesn't matter. If you're teaching chemistry or physics, might not matter that they're sort of book learned all the way up. But if you're teaching Indigenous history, or you're teaching something that's, really you need that ground knowledge from the community. So Leroy's developing a series of sort of levels of, he says it's not enough to just ask whether they're legitimately Indigenous. He said, I need to know what their knowledge is and where it comes from, so that we can understand better whether they're really qualified to teach what we want to hire them to teach. And I thought that was a very interesting point to make as well, that I think other universities might want to think about too, in terms of how many questions. Now, I'm pretty sure Leroy, Jacqueline's nodding, so you obviously know this already. This might be something we could share with people that would be really helpful, because I think other universities, judging by the nods around the room, are going, oh yeah, right, that's a good thing to think about as we're working forward here. So, okay, another thing I wanted to talk about is the difference between ancestry and heritage and identity. So this is an issue that's coming up all over the place. There are a lot of people who previously were saying they were Indigenous, have now backed off, but not very far. It's like they've taken a half step backwards and now they're saying, I have Indigenous heritage or I have Indigenous ancestors, but I'm not claiming to be Indigenous, but I have this heritage. So that's another issue that's coming up. So a lot of these people are the people who have what I call ever so great Indian grandmama from like the 1700s or something like that. And they are claiming that they have Indigenous ancestry. So I was asked by a publisher to do a blurb on the back of a book by a woman, I won't name her, but and she had on the back of the book that she was of Algonquin, French, and Scottish heritage or ancestry. And I had never heard of her. So I Googled her. That's what you do, right? You go figure out who she is. You know, who is this woman who's written this book? And I saw that she's what, you know, I don't like the word pretendian, but she's one of them, right? She's in one article, she's claiming that she's Métis and she grew up with her heritage and she wanted everybody to know about it. And in the next article, I didn't grow up with my heritage, but I wanted my son to know about it. And then in another article, she claims to be Algonquin. And then the next one, she's Métis. And there's like a whole bunch of stuff out there. So I just basically got back to the publisher and said, well, I don't think you should have on the back of her, and she also had a genealogy. I don't think you should say she's got Algonquin ancestry when her only ancestor is from the 1600s. And the publisher said to me, no, well, she's not claiming to be Indigenous. And I said, what do you think that statement reads like to the general public when you say she's got Algonquin ancestry? It's code for she's Algonquin, right? And so they argued with me and I finally said, look, I'm obviously not the person to write the blurb on the back of this book because I'm not even going to read it. And I don't think, I don't think you should publish it. And I certainly don't think you should publish it saying she's got Algonquin ancestry when that's the only link she has. So there are a lot of people who are going to come to your universities with that kind of connection, right? And okay, so then that's a question for you is, are you taking people who are claiming that they have Indigenous ancestry or that they have Indigenous heritage, no matter how tenuous it is? So, and there's another question, what's our cutoff? Like, you know, the Native Council of Canada back in the 70s when they were created had a 3-generation cutoff. They used to say that if you went back further than 3 generations, then that was too far. Now, we lost that somewhere along the line, and the Congress of Aboriginal People has completely, they'll take anybody who can demonstrate any amount of Indigenous ancestry. So I don't have the answers to that. I kind of like the 3-generation thing, that it should be about that, you know, and if you were cut off like a 60s scoop kid, somebody, because 60s, you know, I was born in the 50s, so 60s scoop isn't that long ago. There will be people in the community who will know your family. They'll know who your grandma was or your grandparents. They'll know your family name. They might not know you personally, but they'll know who your family is. So that's a big connection there. And I was personally in Betchico in the Northwest Territories when a young man walked into the office. We were in treaty negotiations with the Tlichon, and a young man walked into the office and the whole room stopped. We were just finished a whole day of treaty negotiations and all the chiefs and everybody are all standing around. And this young man walked in and the whole room went quiet, just like total silence. And they stared at him for about 3 minutes. Nobody said a word. And you could tell he was like just shaking practically. And they're staring at him and staring at him and staring at him. And finally, Ted Blondin says, well, we know you're ours, but who are you? And I loved that they immediately recognized that he was one of theirs, right? And it turns out he was a Blondin, right? And his mother had gone to Edmonton when she was like 16, had a baby, got adopted out, and she came back home and never told anybody that this had happened. But this kid looked like all the Blondins, right? And they just wrapped their arms around him. Like he just became a member of the community and the family, and got connected and started going up there and getting to know his relatives and everything. So we know these things can happen. We know that families are maybe not always happy to see, but probably most of the time happy to see someone who's been taken away from them. And so that child, I think he's got a right to say he's Tlicho. I think he has every right to come back to the community. But this idea of heritage, because of the way he was brought up, he doesn't have a status card, he didn't have any of those sorts of things, right? So I think this is a question. These are all questions for you. What's the cutoff? What is the generational thing, or do we need one? I mean, I'm not even insisting we haven't. I'm just posing questions for you to say these are things we need to think about, because there are so many people coming up with these ancestors from the 16 and 1700s that they haven't known about for 400 years. I have witnessed people say, I always knew I was Métis, with tears rolling down their faces because they discovered some grandma in the 1750s, right? So, you know, it's up to us to set our ideas about who our people are and what our rules are and what our limits are on this. We can't let outsiders do this for us. We have to do it for ourselves and what we think is the right thing to do. So each First Nation is going to end up doing this. The Métis Nation has already taken a big step by creating its own sort of definition. I think there's more work to be done on that, but there's still, these are questions. And for institutions, how are you going to maneuver that? Are you going to take somebody who's got an ancestral connection that's ancient? And what do we do about the people who are embedded, who are already professors, who then go do a genealogy and say, oh, I'm First Nations because I found out that I have da 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 da. More questions. There's, like I said, there's more questions than answers in all this at this point. But I think if we pick off one or two at a time and start to make some decisions about how we're going to deal with that, then the rest will fall in place, or we can then tackle. Don't try and tackle them all at once. It's impossible, right? You'll drive you crazy. Yeah, you'll end up with curly hair, just like mine. Believe it or not, I never used to have curly hair. Just it's the gray. So let me talk about right now. The way I see it across the country is there are 4 different ways of identifying as Indigenous. And these are the things that the universities are going to have to grapple with. So the first one is where this is the ideal one. And this is, if we were in a perfect world, this would be the only one, which is that nations get to determine who their own members are. And that's the end of the story, right? That would be the perfect ideal world. We don't live in an ideal world. We have had our membership, our citizenship, our identity has been monkeyed with by the government and the courts for hundreds of years. So we are that lovely line that we get to determine our own citizenship almost is that purity, that rarity is maybe never going to actually play out. The second one is the Indian Act. So we all know I love this kind of room because I don't have to explain. If I'm in a room where there's a whole bunch of non-Indigenous people, you can spend an hour and a half trying to explain all the intricacies of the Indian Act. But suffice it to say that with all the new changes to the Indian Act, now that they've removed the 1951 cutoff date, You're eligible to be reinstated under the Indian Act if you can trace your ancestry to someone who was enfranchised in 1869. Okay, I think that's like 6 or 7 generations going back. So even if we said that we thought 3 generations was the right idea, the Indian Act is counteracting us already, right? So the third one is I call them the Daniels Métis. And this is the people that the Supreme Court of Canada, I think, got terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. And the reason they got it wrong is there's a saying among us lawyers, we say bad facts make bad law. And so what happened in that case was that they conflated non-status Indians with Métis, and then they took the facts about non-status Indians and applied them to the Métis. And that led the court to say that there was no need for community acceptance on who was your member, because that wasn't a Section 35 right. So I think there's lots of things wrong in this. There's a lot of errors there. The first one is conflating the evidence about non-status Indians with Métis. They have somewhat similar issues in some ways and entirely different issues in others. And the fact that some First Nation women were denied coming back into their communities afterwards, after having had their membership removed for marrying out or whatever, the fact that they couldn't come back to their communities has nothing to do with the Métis. We live in cities, St. Boniface, St. Vital, Edmonton. We couldn't stop, and we had no wish to stop people coming back into our communities. We didn't do it. So conflating that evidence with the Métis is completely wrong. It's a factual, important, fundamental error. The second one, I have allergies. So the second one is that they said that Section 30, it's not a Section 35 right. And I think that is fundamentally wrong. What are they saying? Only hunting and fishing are Section 35 rights? That's crazy. The most fundamental Section 35 right is the right to determine who your members are, is your right of self-determination. So that's another fundamental error on the part of the Supreme Court of Canada. So then the last group is non-status Indians. The definition of non-status Indians is anybody who's ineligible for the Indian Act. That's everyone in Canada, right? Everyone in Canada, other than those who are actually eligible, is a non-status Indian according to that definition. That's white people, that's everybody. Because all those people who are not eligible are non-status Indians. It's an insane definition. And yet these two, non-status Indians and Daniels Métis, I call them free-range individuals, right? Like free-range chickens. And the other thing that, is you do understand that if somebody tells you you're buying free-range eggs from Saskatchewan in January, you have to ask yourself where the free range is, right? Okay, so you should ask the same question about these free-range Daniels and non-status Indian people. There's no free range out there. This is nonsense. These are 4 irreconcilable concepts of how we determine membership. You don't even try to make them fit together because they don't. So the problem we have with that is that that's law from the Supreme Court of Canada. It's law across the country, and you're not allowed to ignore it, right? Now, personally, I would like to ignore it. I would like to take a case to the Supreme Court of Canada where we challenge the Daniels case, but it's too soon. They only did it in 14. They won't take it up again right away. They will eventually, but not right now. So you're stuck. You're university people here. You're trying to figure out membership and everything, and you've got these 4 completely irreconcilable ideas about who is Indigenous, and 2 of them are, quite frankly, insane. So you're going to have to make sense of that. And I have no answers for you on how you can make this work, because there's no logic to it and there's no good way out of it. There's no really good answer for all of this stuff. Unless you decide as a university that you are going to stick with perhaps you have to go with Indian Act status, and certainly you should go with the First Nations and the Indigenous peoples who have created their own membership rules and are following them and are acting as nations. You follow those. What are you going to do about those Daniels Métis? What's going to happen is eventually you're going to get sued by somebody, some faculty member or somebody's going to sue you. And personally, you know, as the lawyer in me goes, good, bring it on. Let's take on that case, but you won't like it. You're going to go, oh, no, we don't want to get sued, right? So those are the pitfalls of this road we're all walking down in this room, trying to figure out how to deal with this on an institutional level. So, now the reason I said I don't like the word pretendian, I just want to call it what it is. It's fraud. Okay. The definition of fraud. Yeah. The definition of fraud is intentional deception for material gain. Okay. So there's a lot of important words in there. Intentional, right? All of these fraudsters, this is not an accident. They do this over decades. They construct a new identity over decades, and it's very intentional. They make decision after decision after decision that puts them in the place that they're in. It's not an accident that they got where they were. So it's intentional, and it is deception. It's a lie. It's a series of lies. It's a whole house of lies that's put together, and it is for material gain. Now, I think that a lot of people use the word monetize. They're monetizing this. And that's actually, I think it's a good word, right? They're doing it in order to get prestige. They're doing it to get jobs. They're doing it to get grant money. They're doing it for the fact that maybe it gives them a squeak into a profession or into a position of power that they would not have got if they were just normal white girl. They wouldn't have been able to squeak their way into that position. So it is intentional deception for material gain. So I think we should call it what it is. Instead of being this cute pretendians, they're fraud artists. That's what they are. And they're also impersonators. Now, there is actually a criminal code provision about impersonation, but it's not what they're doing isn't impersonation the way we think it is. Impersonation would be if I was telling you that I'm Maria Campbell. And I've been walking around for years telling people I'm Maria Campbell. That's impersonation, okay? I would never do that, Maria. But that's impersonation because it's an individual, right? I would be pretending to be an individual. And these people aren't pretending to be an individual. They're just pretending to be a whole nation, right? They're taking on a larger identity, right? And a lot of them are doing it in the hopes that they won't ever be discovered. And that's built, they get very confident in that. I think that's why their lies get more elaborate, is because they do succeed for years and years and years and years and years without being outed. Now, I want to tell you that some of them have weathered an outing in the past. So for Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, I don't know how many of you know Frank magazine. Probably most of you are too young, but there's a few nods out there. If you were back in the 90s in Ottawa ever, it's basically a gossip rag. And it was funny though. It was very funny. And every time I went to Ottawa, I always picked it up. But I missed the issue where they exposed Mary Ellen back in 1991. And I've never seen it, but I've heard a few people tell me about it. So, but she weathered that, right? She just seemed to just swim over it and continued on. So some people have had a lot of questions asked in the past. They've even been exposed in the media and they still continue on. So I think those are all the points. But my point basically is that I think we shouldn't call them pretendians, call them fraudsters. call them fraud artists, call them what they are. Because the other thing is, if we call it by the name that it really is, then we're naming it and then you can't avoid it. So it's kind of, maybe you can I'm just a pretendian, that's okay. But if you're a fraud, if you're accused of fraud, people are calling you a fraudster, then you have to pay attention. I'm just going to wrap up and then I'm getting the message. So I just want to say one other thing. I know it's hard for the Academy trying to, I think you've got an impossible task in many ways. I really do. I appreciate the complexities of trying to dig in on this and trying to do it. And I understand you've got unions to deal with. You've got collective agreements. You've got all kinds of embedded issues that you have to maneuver around. So I want to say I fully appreciate the difficulties of this, but my suggestion is that the thing you should lean on, as opposed to trying to figure out identity issues, I know you have to do that, but for the embedded people and for the people who are applying to come in, is honesty. And we had someone talk about that this morning, about truth and honesty. And I liked the distinction that truth's what comes out of your mouth and honesty is you're walking the truth. I really liked that line, but I think you have to lean on the honesty issue. Are these people being honest in what they say? That allows you to investigate them. It allows you to check out what they say. You should, when they come in, have them sign a declaration. That would go for students, for applicants, for faculty, for staff. Sign a declaration that says what I'm saying is true. I'm being honest in what I say. And if you find out that I'm not being honest, there will be repercussions, maybe even firing. And they sign that when they come in, and then you have something that you can use for trying to create investigations for people who are already embedded in the university, because I know that's the problem right now. The people who are coming in, newbies, that's the easy part of the problem. You can set up barriers for that. It's the ones who are already there. Those are the problems. And the people who suffer the most are their students and the people who are trying to raise the issue or the faculty who are trying to raise the issue about another embedded, perhaps tenured professor. And these are the problems. But if you lean in on the honesty issue, as opposed to the Indigenous identity issue, I think it gives you a road in on the investigation. So I think I don't have time to go into the privacy issue, but I'll open it up for comments, right? For questions. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Jean, for your presentation. And we do have a question. Gahandi.
Is it working? There we go. Gahanta Yuchit. Akskare wake ni I kanyaka haka. Neon joto. Gahanta Yuchit. Akskare wake ni I kanyaka haga. Neon joto. I'm Associate Vice President, Indigenous Teaching, Learning and Research at Carleton University.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how limited we are in terms of the language. We're limited by having to use the English language mm-hmm. in all these contexts to describe ourselves, to create policy, to communicate the issues to others that need to understand them. And I obviously, we don't have any answers, because oftentimes we end up, when we write, like, for example, when I write and I try to describe what I'm trying to describe about Kanyakahaga culture, I use the language, but then I end up having to spend a lot of time describing what that means in the English language for it to make sense, because that's really crucial, right? Being able to incorporate our own languages into our writing, into our research, into the work context that we find ourselves in. So, I'm wondering, how do we grapple with with the fact that we are forced to use the English language. We're forced to use terms like Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations, Inuit, Métis. I mean, Métis might be your own term that's acceptable, but for the rest of us, you know, we end up having to use these words that have meaning within the dominant society, but in their application have another meaning within our own communities. Like even using the term nation, right, to describe ourselves, like you're saying, think about the idea of nation, think about the idea of citizenship, think about the idea of identity. And those are very limiting terms for us. So how do we grapple with that? I mean, I know you won't have an answer, but I'm just putting that out there because I know we're all thinking about things like that. And this is something that I encounter all the time, and I have to consistently point it out that here, you know, we are limited by the English language. So how do we get beyond that? What do we do about that, especially in this context?
I take your point and thank you for the observation. I've always said that that's why the terminology changes all the time. We were Indians and then natives and then Aboriginal and now Indigenous. And it's always because we're searching for a basket English word to describe all these different Indigenous peoples. So, and my thought is it's going to keep changing, right? You know, 5 years from now, it's going to be another word, and although the UN Declaration might embed Indigenous for a long time, but you know, I think that grappling for language is part of exactly the problem. The only thing I think is we should use our own languages. You know, I mean, you know, I certainly didn't grow up being called Métis. I grew up being called a NICF. So I'm not, you know, I would, if anybody ever listened to me, which they don't, or at least the politicians don't, I would change it to the Michif Nation and let everybody else argue over the word Métis. Just let everybody else deal with it. But like I said, people don't listen to me, so it doesn't matter. But I totally agree with you. The idea of the word nation, although I have to say the Michif Nation always used the word nation for like 200 years. It's not a new thing at all. Cuthbert Grant was using the word nation. So, but I get it. So why not use your own languages? And I know you have to describe what it means, but then stick to it. People use the word Saskatchewan. We use the word Ontario. We use the word Toronto. You know, these are all Indigenous words that are people use without even thinking about it. So I just think we should just, I don't know, I don't mean clobber them over the head with your language, but you know, slip it in. You know, people are using it eventually, I think. I don't know another answer. Oh, no, I think she's beating. Where?
Kanseji.
Does it?
My name is Manon, and I'm a member of the Musqueam Lake Cree Nation. So I wanted to just add maybe a few facts. The whole issue with Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafont obviously, you know, touched our community in ways that, you know, I think you can imagine. One of the ways that it touched us is that, like many of our institutions, when one of these scam artists is outed, their first knee-jerk reaction was to line themselves up behind her in support of her. And we've seen our institutions do this too, many, many times. And they do it without having all the facts, before consulting any of us. And then they find themselves in situations very often where they have to retract their support and apologize for their quick reaction. And our community in Musqueam Lake has yet to do that. our leadership has not retracted that. They haven't come forward to say that maybe we're a bit too hasty. We've known for a while that Mary Ellen isn't who she said she was, but because of who she's married to, she is married to somebody who is a prominent member of our community, somebody who is a leader and who is well respected for what he does in our world. Nobody wanted to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And we're too nice. So when it broke out in the news, one of the first things that I did, because we had just reached a settlement with the government related to the 1919 Social Settlement Act, which was resulting in a per capita distribution. And in my head, I thought, no way they gave this woman some of that money. So I went to check on our membership list, and she is not on the membership list. So I don't know what our membership, our leadership was trying to say, but she's not on our membership list. So for me, that was something that I just wanted to bring forward to all of your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jean. There's 2 questions online. So
Sure. So the first question actually is quite related to the question that, or the comment that was just made, which is from Dr. Dorothy Christian. What responsibilities do members like Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond have to First Nations who say she is a member? To the First Nations who says she is a member?
Well, I personally think that we all have a responsibility to the nations of which we're members. I mean, I feel a great responsibility to the name that I carry, the real name, and to the issues that my family has fought and died for. And I feel very, very responsible to speak and to teach and to carry on that everything that I was raised with, that my family has been engaged in for hundreds of years. So I feel that, and I think that every member of an Indigenous nation should have some responsibility back to their people in every way. So, but with people who are, even if you marry in, you're marrying into a family, gives you family responsibilities, gives you lifetime relationships. You know, Mary Ellen's children are the grandchildren of some people there. They're cousins and aunties and uncles. There's huge family there. I think there's massive relationships that give you a responsibility to nurture and to be part of. And so I'm politically, I'm not sure about that, but certainly the family relationships are there, whether she's a registered member or not. She's still married to a member, and her children are, I think her children are members. I'm not actually sure, but I think they are. So, that's all I can say about that one.
thanks, Jean. We have one more question, and then we're going to break for lunch.
So the last question comes from Darren Crochain. How do we, Indigenous faculty and staff, deal with institutional actors who put roadblocks into employing, hiring protocols that are consistent with Indigenous ways of asking for heritage, genealogy, and/or letters of support from First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities?
Yeah, the dealing with any institution is tough because as I think somebody said this morning, I think it was Michelle, institutions are there to foster the institution. That's what their job, that's why they're an institution. So the fact that the institutions are colonial institutions, the fact that I think Patricia Barkauskas told me that I may be wrong about this, but there's only like 1% of faculty across the country are Indigenous or something like that. Like, it's really small, really, really small. It might even be less than that. So the fact that you're going to run into an embedded system of people who either don't care about your issue or don't understand it and or can't be bothered to deal with it, or think you're just a pain in the neck and would you just take your whining somewhere else. I mean, that's embedded in all institutions, but in particular in the academy, which is largely still, as I understand it, white male. So you're bucking up again, and probably a lot of them are older. So I would guess that the bulk of the professors and everybody are not your 20-year-old people. So they are still well embedded in the sort of colonial structures and ideas and belief system. And then the other part of it is, well, what's so wrong with it? That's the attitude I see. What's wrong with this? Seems fine. I mean, we're giving kids a good education, you know, we're letting in these BIPOC people, you know, like we're even teaching some of those other subjects now, you know, like that's the kind of attitude that's still embedded in the university. And so I think it must feel, I actually am an adjunct professor at UBC sometimes, but it allows me to just walk in, teach, and walk out again. So I never have to deal with the administration. So, but I imagine, and I'm seeing it, that you must feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall over and over and over again. And I know that a lot of people have left these institutions because it's so frustrating and because they can't seem to get anywhere. And all I can say is that we're all just going to have to keep butting our heads, because it's never going to change if we all walk away. It just won't. So some of us are just going to have to get crash helmets and armor on and just, you know, keep working on this. I do think that what's happened right now, we've had a moment, Kim Tallbear was talking about this, you know, we had this moment when Mary Ellen was exposed because of the media attention. When there were a lot of stories out there and a lot of issues, and I saw a lot of universities reacting, some of them very badly, UBC. The provost sent I think it was Dean, I think Gage Averill's the provost, but I might be giving them the wrong title, sent a letter out to all the faculty saying that they wanted to avoid looking like they were in damage control. You know, I just go, oh my. Speaking about media lessons, some people could use basic communication lessons about what you say to your people. But the idea that these institutions are not going to change. I mean, the way I look at it, and I've spent most of my life not dealing with universities, but dealing with government. And the way I think about government is this: government's like a big dinosaur, and it's got many heads, and they all have very small brains, and none of them talk to each other. So it's this beast that's just kind of lumbering along, and, you know, Department of Defense head is over here, and Indigenous Affairs is over there, and health is over here, and all these other, they're all over the place. They're generally walking in this big direction, but they don't talk to each other, and they don't really look down at the riffraff on the ground, you and me, right? So trying to turn that beast, even to get one of the heads talking to the other, trying to turn the beast around to go in an entirely different direction, like decolonize it, it's a 100-year job, right? It's not, nothing of this is going, they've had hundreds of years to build these universities are thousands of years old. I was at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow a few years ago giving a lecture, and they're like, it's the oldest university on the continent. I think it's like from 1100 or even earlier, 900 or something. they're ancient, they're embedded, they're not going to change easily. Doesn't mean they won't change, but it's not quick. So if you're banging your head against the brick wall of this or the dinosaur or trying to get its attention, just remember that, like, don't expend all your energy in one effort. Just keep plugging away, because remember, sometimes a little mouse scurrying along can freak the big beast out and it'll turn around. Whereas if you hammer at it with big machines, it's got big arm, it's tough. It won't change. So sometimes a little small thing can fundamentally spark a huge change. And sometimes it's just a, like the raindrop dripping and dripping and dripping and dripping and dripping, and eventually wears the stone away or puts a crack in the stone. I personally think what we have to think of ourselves is that raindrop that's just dripping and dripping and dripping and dripping, and we're going to, and eventually it will start to change. Things are changing. I just want to, I'll end on this, but okay, I'm going to be 70 in a couple of months, and things have changed since I was a kid in the 50s. It's very, very different. So if you, Maria's laughing because it's changed, right? I'm of an age, I've seen lots of change. We are nowhere near where we were. We've made significant progress and huge change. Huge change. So for those of you who are young and don't feel like anything's changing, it's not true. It is changing. It's changing dramatically, and it's changing because of people like you in this room, because of what you're doing and the fact that you don't shut up and that you keep going at it. And there's more and more of us every year, every generation, there's more and more people. It is changing. We can do it. And have great confidence that these issues in the academy that we are beginning to tackle, we can change them. Won't happen tomorrow. We'll make some mistakes. We'll take 4 steps forward and a couple backwards, but we will do it. And I have great faith in the people in this room, because you all have good hearts and good minds and good intentions, and you're determined to do something about it, or you wouldn't be here. So kudos to all of you. My hat's off to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, very much for your presentation. And yes, it does feel like that on a daily basis. Banging your head against the wall. I know we all feel it all the time. So, but coming together like this is needed for all of us to feel the support that we're all going through the same thing in every one of our institutions. So, and to have your support, Jean, as well, and to help us through the process is really important. So thank you again, and thank everybody. Thank you. Yeah.
We got some special gifts for these presenters as well too. So for those of you, by all means, I'll just do a quick plug here for Indigenous Box. I've been a big fan of these too. So I was following around the presenters actually saying, what's in those? What's in those? So by all means, I encourage you to do the same. So on behalf of all of us here, please accept these as small tokens of our appreciation for what you've shared with us today.